The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. Captain Sarah "Ghost" Martinez adjusted her helmet as she walked toward her AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. The familiar weight of her flight gear felt reassuring after 3 months of deployment. Her gunner, Warrant Officer Jake Thompson, was already running pre-flight checks on their bird, call sign Reaper 21. The briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were moving weapons through a mountain pass 30 clicks northeast of their position. Sarah and Jake were part of a 4-ship formation, tasked with conducting reconnaissance and providing close air support if needed. The other 3 Apaches were crewed by seasoned pilots she had trained with back at Fort Carson. As Sarah climbed into the front cockpit, she noticed something different about this mission. The usual chatter over the radio seemed more subdued. Even Jake, who normally cracked jokes to ease pre-mission tension, was unusually quiet as he settled into the gunner's seat behind her. "Ghost, you seeing what I'm seeing on the intel feeds?" Jake's voice crackled through the intercom as he pulled up thermal imaging data from their previous patrol. Sarah studied the display, noting unusual heat signatures scattered throughout the valley they were about to patrol. The patterns didn't match typical civilian activity or even standard Taliban movement. Something felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. "Roger that, Jake. Keep your eyes sharp today. I've got a feeling this isn't going to be a routine recon mission." The Apache's twin turboshaft engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Sarah felt the familiar vibration through her seat as the rotor blades began their steady rotation. She had logged over 800 combat hours in these machines, but every takeoff still gave her the same rush of adrenaline mixed with focused determination. As Reaper 21 lifted off the dusty landing zone, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that today would test everything she had learned about aerial combat. The mountains ahead looked peaceful in the morning light, but appearances in Afghanistan were always deceiving. The formation of 4 Apaches flew northeast, maintaining radio silence as they approached the suspected transit route. Sarah's hands moved instinctively across the controls, adjusting their flight path to follow the natural contours of the terrain. Below them, the landscape shifted from desert scrub to rocky outcroppings and narrow valleys where insurgents could easily hide heavy weapons. "Ghost, I'm picking up movement in Sector 7, Jake reported, his voice steady despite the potential threat. "Looks like 3 vehicles moving fast through the pass." Sarah banked the Apache slightly to get a better view, her experienced eyes scanning the terrain below. The vehicles appeared to be civilian trucks, but in this region, appearances meant nothing. Taliban fighters regularly use civilian vehicles to transport weapons and fighters, making positive identification crucial before any engagement. "All stations, this is Reaper 21. We have eyes on 3 vehicles moving through the primary transit route. Beginning identification procedures." The other Apache pilots acknowledged her transmission, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settle on her shoulders. As the flight leader, every decision would impact not just her and Jake, but the entire formation and potentially ground forces operating in the area. As they descended for a closer look, Sarah noticed the vehicles had stopped in a clearing surrounded by steep rock walls. Through her targeting system, she could see figures moving around the trucks, but the distance and terrain made positive identification impossible. "Jake, what's your assessment? Are we looking at combatants or civilians?" Before Jake could respond, Sarah's threat warning system lit up like a Christmas tree. The familiar tone filled her headset, indicating that radar-guided surface-to-air missiles were tracking their formation. Her blood ran cold as she realized they had flown directly into a carefully planned ambush. "Brake right. Brake right." "Sam, launch detected." Sarah's voice cut through the radio as she threw the Apache into a violent evasive maneuver. The helicopter responded instantly, banking hard to the right as she simultaneously deployed chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missiles. The mountain valley erupted in chaos as multiple surface-to-air missiles streaked upward from concealed positions. What they had assumed was a simple transportation route had been transformed into a sophisticated kill zone. The Taliban had learned from previous encounters with American air power and had prepared accordingly. Jake's voice was steady despite the circumstances as he worked his targeting systems. "Ghost, I count at least 6 launch positions spread throughout the valley. They've got us bracketed from multiple angles." Sarah's training kicked in as she maneuvered the Apache through the deadly airspace. Years of combat experience had taught her to think 3 steps ahead during aerial engagements. While evading the immediate missile threat, she was already calculating escape routes and potential attack vectors. Reaper Flight, this is 2-1. Execute Tactic 7 immediately. We need to break their targeting solutions before they can reload. Tactic 7 was an aggressive maneuver they had practiced countless times, but never used in actual combat. It required the 4 Apaches to split into 2 elements, with each pair attacking from opposite directions to overwhelm the enemy's air defense network. The other pilots acknowledged her order, and Sarah watched as Reaper 2-2 and 2-3 peeled off to attack from the northern approach, while she and Reaper 2-4 prepared to assault from the south. The maneuver would expose all 4 helicopters to additional risk, but staying grouped together in the kill zone meant certain destruction. As Sarah guided her Apache through another evasive maneuver, she caught sight of Reaper 2-3 taking a hit. The helicopter shuddered as shrapnel from a proximity-fused missile peppered its tail section, but the pilot managed to maintain control and continue the attack run. 2-3, what's your status? Sarah called out while simultaneously engaging targets on the ground with her 30mm chain gun. We're hit but still flying. Ghost. Lost some hydraulics but the bird's still responding. The damaged Apache continued its attack run, raining down Hellfire missiles on the SAM positions below. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching her fellow pilots perform under extreme pressure. This was why they trained so hard back home, so they could function as a cohesive unit when everything went wrong. Jake had been busy during the evasive maneuvers, identifying and prioritizing targets throughout the valley. Ghost, I've got positive identification on multiple weapon systems. These aren't just shoulder-fired missiles. They've got vehicle-mounted SAMs and what looks like a ZSU-23 anti-aircraft gun. The sophistication of the ambush was becoming clear. The Taliban had assembled a significant air defense network in this remote valley, probably planning to use it against future helicopter operations in the region. Stumbling into it had been pure bad luck, but Sarah was determined to ensure they didn't get the chance to use these weapons against other American forces. All stations, we're going to take out this entire network before we leave. Jake, start marking targets for the others. As the 4 Apaches pressed their attack, Sarah noticed something troubling in her peripheral vision. High above the valley, she caught the glint of sunlight reflecting off metal. Her blood chilled as she realized what she was seeing. Additional aircraft were approaching their position and they weren't friendly. The situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Not only were they dealing with a sophisticated ground-based air defense network, but enemy aircraft were now converging on their position. Sarah's mind raced as she calculated the odds of survival against multiple threats. Jake, are you seeing aircraft approaching from the northeast? Negative, Ghost, I'm focused on ground targets. What are you seeing? Sarah strained her eyes against the glare of the morning sun, trying to get a better look at the approaching contacts. The aircraft were still too far away to identify positively, but their flight patterns suggested they were military rather than civilian. Reaper Flight. Be advised we may have enemy aircraft inbound from the northeast. Continue engaging ground targets, but stay alert for air-to-air threats. The acknowledgement from her fellow pilots was terse as they concentrated on their own survival while pressing the attack against the SAM sites. Sarah realized they were facing every pilot's nightmare, a coordinated ambush involving both ground and air threats designed to overwhelm their defensive capabilities. As another missile streaked past her cockpit, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Instead of continuing the evasive pattern, she turned directly toward the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. Sarah's aggressive turn caught the enemy gunners off guard. Instead of retreating as they expected, she was flying directly into their most concentrated fire zone. The maneuver was calculated but extremely risky. Getting closer to the SAM sites would give Jake better targeting solutions, but it also meant flying through the deadliest part of the kill zone. Ghost, what are you doing? Jake's voice carried a hint of concern as he watched their altitude drop and their speed increase toward the enemy positions. Trust me, Jake. Sometimes you have to fly toward the threat to survive it. The Apache's 30mm chain gun opened up as Sarah lined up on a ZSU-23, position that had been causing problems for the entire formation. The armor-piercing rounds found their target, and the anti-aircraft gun exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. One threat down, but many more remained active. Jake had found his rhythm in the gunner's seat, systematically engaging targets with Hellfire missiles, while Sarah maneuvered to avoid incoming fire. Their teamwork was seamless, developed through hundreds of hours of training and months of combat operations together. Reaper 2-4 is taking heavy fire. The transmission from their wingman sent a chill through Sarah's spine. She looked up to see the other Apache trailing smoke as it attempted to climb out of the valley. 2-4, can you make it to the rally point? Negative, Ghost. We're losing power and altitude. Going to have to set down somewhere secure. A forced landing in hostile territory was every pilot's worst nightmare. Sarah knew she had to make a decision quickly. Continue the attack on the remaining SAM sites or break off to provide cover for the downed crew. Jake, how many targets do we have left? I count 4 active SAM sites plus at least a dozen personnel with shoulder-fired missiles. If we leave now, they'll be able to engage 2-4 during their landing approach. The tactical situation was becoming impossible. Sarah couldn't abandon her wingman, but she also couldn't allow the remaining air defense network to remain operational. The enemy had planned this ambush perfectly, forcing the American pilots into an impossible choice. All stations, this is Ghost. We're going to suppress the remaining sites while 2-4 finds a landing zone. 2-2 and 2-3 establish a defensive pattern over 2-4's position. As Sarah spoke, she caught another glimpse of the approaching aircraft. They were definitely military jets, and they were closing fast on the valley. Her worst fears were confirmed when Jake's radar warning receiver identified them as MiG-29 fighters. Ghost, we've got MiGs inbound, 2 of them approaching from the north. The situation had escalated beyond anything they had trained for. 4 Apache attack helicopters were now facing a coordinated attack from both sophisticated ground-based air defenses and modern fighter aircraft. The odds of all 4 crews surviving were diminishing rapidly. Sarah's mind raced through their options. The Apaches were formidable against ground targets, but they were sitting ducks against fast-moving jets. Their only advantage was the confined space of the mountain valley, which would limit the MiG's maneuverability and prevent them from using their speed advantage effectively. Reaper flight. Those MiGs are going to be on us in less than 2 minutes. 2-4, you need to get on the ground immediately. The rest of us are going to create some chaos to keep them busy. Sarah knew what she was asking of her pilots. They were essentially volunteering to serve as decoys while their wingman attempted an emergency landing. It was the kind of decision that would either be remembered as heroic or tragic, depending on how the next few minutes played out. The first MiG appeared over the ridgeline like a deadly silver dart, immediately launching air-to-air missiles at the Apache formation. Sarah pulled her helicopter into another violent evasive maneuver, feeling the G-forces press her deep into her seat as the aircraft responded to her control inputs. Missile launch. Everyone brake now. The valley filled with contrails as missiles and countermeasures created a deadly light show against the morning sky. Sarah had never felt more alive or more aware of how quickly everything could end. Every second stretched into an eternity as she waited to see if her aircraft would survive the engagement. Jake was calling out targets and threats in a steady stream, his voice remaining calm despite the chaos surrounding them. Second MiG coming in from the east. He's got a firing solution on 2-3. Sarah watched in horror as the second fighter jet lined up on Reaper 2-3, the damaged Apache that was already struggling with hydraulic problems. The crew was basically defenseless against the supersonic attacker, flying a wounded bird through a nightmare scenario. 2-3, dive for the deck now. But even as she gave the warning, Sarah realized it might be too late. The MiG was already in position for the kill shot, and there was nothing she could do to help her fellow pilots from her current position. The next few seconds would determine whether her crew would be going home with a heroic story or with the weight of lost friends on their shoulders. The damaged Apache dove toward the valley floor as Sarah watched helplessly from her position. Reaper 2-3 was too far away for her to provide effective support, and the MiG pilot was lining up for what appeared to be a certain kill. The enemy fighter had every advantage: speed, altitude, and modern air-to-air missiles designed specifically for this type of engagement. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of pressing the attack, the MiG pilot seemed to hesitate. Sarah caught a glimpse of movement on her radar display that didn't make sense. Additional aircraft were approaching the valley, but these new contacts were coming from the south. "Ghost, are you seeing this?" Jake's voice carried confusion rather than fear for the first time since the engagement began. "I'm showing multiple fast movers approaching from grid 7-7. Sarah checked her own displays and felt a surge of hope. The new radar contacts were displaying the proper identification codes for friendly aircraft. American F-16 Fighting Falcons were approaching the valley at high speed, apparently responding to their emergency calls for assistance. All Reaper stations, we have friendly fast movers inbound from the south. Maintain your current positions and let them handle the MiGs. The timing couldn't have been better. Just as the second MiG was preparing to engage Reaper 2-3, the lead F-16 appeared over the southern ridgeline. The enemy pilot immediately abandoned his attack run on the Apache and turned to meet this new threat. Sarah used the distraction to reposition her helicopter closer to the remaining SAM sites. With the MiGs occupied by the F-16s, she could focus on eliminating the ground threats that were still preventing Reaper 2-4 from landing safely. Jake, give me targeting solutions on those remaining SAM sites. We need to clear a safe zone for 2-4's emergency landing. The air battle above them was brief but intense. The F-16 pilots had trained extensively for air-to-air combat, and they quickly gained the upper hand against the older MiG-29s. Within minutes, both enemy fighters were either destroyed or fleeing northward, leaving the valley clear for the Apaches to complete their mission. Reaper 2-4, what's your status on the emergency landing? Ghost, we found a suitable clearing about 2 clicks east of the main valley. We're going to need immediate extraction once we're on the ground. This bird isn't flying anywhere. Sarah coordinated with the other Apache crews to establish a defensive perimeter around 2-4's landing site. The ground-based air defense network had been largely neutralized, but there were still enemy personnel in the area who might attempt to capture or kill the downed aircrew. As 2-4 settled onto the rocky ground in a controlled crash landing, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and determination. They had survived the initial ambush and the air-to-air engagement, but the mission wasn't over. Now they had to protect their fellow crew members until ground forces could arrive for extraction. Jake, I want you to keep eyes on that landing site. If anyone approaches our people, they're going to have a very bad day. The next hour passed slowly as the 3 remaining Apaches maintained overwatch of the crash site. Sarah's aircraft was running low on fuel and ammunition, but she wasn't about to abandon her crew members on the ground. The bond between military aviators went beyond simple duty. These people were family. Ghost, I've got movement in the tree line north of the landing site, Jake reported. Looks like a squad-sized element moving toward 2-4's position. Sarah immediately turned toward the threat, her finger hovering over the weapon system controls. Through her targeting system, she could see approximately 8 individuals moving through the sparse vegetation, carrying what appeared to be assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. All stations, we have enemy personnel approaching the crash site from the north. Engaging now. The 30mm chain gun spoke again as Sarah engaged the approaching enemy squad. The armor-piercing rounds were devastatingly effective against personnel in the open, and the threat was neutralized quickly. But Sarah knew this was probably just the first of many enemy units that would be drawn to the area. 2-4, how long until you can destroy your aircraft and be ready for extraction? Give us another 10 minutes, Ghost. We need to remove the classified equipment and prepare demolition charges. 10 minutes felt like an eternity when you were low on fuel and ammunition, surrounded by hostile forces in mountainous terrain. Sarah checked her fuel gauge again and calculated that they had maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining before they would be forced to land themselves. Jake, start looking for alternate landing sites in case we run out of gas before the extraction team arrives. As if reading her thoughts, Jake pointed toward a relatively flat area, about 3 kilometers south of their current position. That ridgeline might work if we have to put down. It's defensible and close enough to provide continued support. Sarah was about to respond when her threat warning system activated again. But this time the tone was different, indicating a radar lock from aircraft rather than ground-based systems. She looked up to see additional contacts approaching from the northeast, and her heart sank as she realized the enemy had called in reinforcements. The new radar contacts were moving fast and closing on their position. Sarah's threat warning receiver identified them as additional MiG-29s, apparently part of a second wave of enemy fighters. The F-16s that had saved them earlier were already heading back to base, low on fuel and ammunition themselves. Reaper flight, we have more MiGs inbound. 2-4, you need to expedite that demolition and get ready for pickup now. Sarah's mind raced through their limited options. 3 damaged Apaches, 1 crew on the ground, enemy fighters approaching and rapidly diminishing fuel and ammunition. The tactical situation was deteriorating quickly, and she needed to make decisions that would give everyone the best chance of survival. Jake, what's our current ammunition status? We've got maybe 50 rounds of 30mm left and 2 Hellfire missiles. Not exactly ideal for air-to-air combat. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Apache helicopters were among the most sophisticated attack aircraft in the world, but they were designed to fight ground targets, not supersonic fighter jets. Against MiGs, they were flying coffins unless they could somehow turn the engagement to their advantage. All stations, we're going to use the terrain to our advantage. Stay low in the valley and make them come down to fight us on our terms. The approaching MiGs appeared over the northern ridge line, just as Reaper 2-4's crew finished preparing their helicopter for destruction. Sarah watched the downed air crew sprint toward a defensive position they had established among the rocks, carrying their personal weapons and essential survival gear. 2-4 crew is clear of the aircraft. Initiating demolition in 30 seconds. The explosion that destroyed Reaper 2-4 sent a column of black smoke high into the air, marking their position for both friendly and enemy forces. Sarah knew the smoke would draw more attention, but they couldn't allow the sophisticated Apache technology to fall into enemy hands. The lead MiG dove toward the valley floor, apparently intending to strafe the crash site and eliminate the survivors. Sarah positioned her Apache between the fighter and the crew on the ground, essentially using her helicopter as a shield. Ghost, that MiG has missile lock on us. Jake's warning came just as Sarah threw the Apache into another violent evasive maneuver. The air-to-air missile streaked past their rotor disc, missing by mere meters before impacting the mountainside behind them. Sarah had never come closer to death in all her years of combat flying, but her focus remained laser-sharp on protecting the crew on the ground. Jake, can you get a Hellfire lock on that MiG when he comes around for another pass? It's going to be tricky, but if he stays low and slow enough, maybe. The missile wasn't designed for air-to-air, but it might work if we get lucky. The second MiG was circling high above the valley, apparently waiting for his wingman to finish off the helicopters before committing to the attack. Sarah realized this might be their only chance. If they could eliminate the low-flying MiG, the second one might withdraw rather than risk a one-on-one engagement. Reaper 2-2 and 2-3, I need you to create a distraction while Jake and I try something crazy. The other 2 Apaches immediately spread out and began flying erratic patterns designed to confuse the enemy pilots. Sarah used the distraction to position herself for what she knew was likely a one-shot opportunity. The lead MiG came around for another attack run, diving toward the valley floor at high speed. Jake had been tracking the fighter with his targeting system, waiting for the perfect moment when the aircraft would be close enough and slow enough for a Hellfire engagement. I've got tone.
Firing now!
The Hellfire missile left its rail with a distinctive whoosh, immediately beginning its programmed flight path toward the enemy fighter. Sarah held her breath as she watched the missile track toward its target, knowing that their survival might depend on this single shot. The MiG pilot apparently detected the missile launch and began defensive maneuvers, but he was too low and too fast to avoid the incoming threat effectively. The Hellfire impacted the fighter's left wing, causing the aircraft to cartwheel across the valley floor before exploding against the mountainside. Direct hit. MiG down! Jake's excited voice filled the intercom as they watched the enemy fighter disintegrate. The second MiG immediately climbed out of the valley and disappeared over the northern ridgeline. Apparently unwilling to continue the engagement alone, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as the immediate air threat diminished, but she knew their problems were far from over. All stations, we need immediate extraction for 2-4's crew. Our fuel situation is becoming critical. As if summoned by her words, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters from the south. 2 UH-60 Blackhawks appeared over the ridgeline, escorted by another pair of Apache gunships. The cavalry had finally arrived, but Sarah wondered if it might be too late to save everyone. Her fuel warning light was now illuminated, indicating less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining. The extraction would have to be fast and precise, or they would all be walking home through hostile territory. The lead Blackhawk approached the crash site while Sarah and the other Apaches established a defensive perimeter. Every second counted now as their fuel gauges showed critical levels. Sarah's aircraft was running on fumes and she could see vapor trails coming from Reaper 2-3's damaged engine, indicating they were losing oil pressure. Ghost, the extraction team is on the ground, came the radio call from the Blackhawk crew chief. We need 2 minutes to load the survivors and get airborne. 2 minutes felt like an eternity when you were flying a helicopter that could fall out of the sky at any moment. Sarah forced herself to remain calm as she scanned the surrounding terrain for additional threats. The enemy had already demonstrated sophisticated planning and coordination. She couldn't assume they wouldn't have backup plans. Jake, keep your eyes open for anything that moves. The bad guys might try one more push while the extraction is happening. Sure enough, Jake spotted movement on the eastern ridge line. Ghost. I've got what looks like a mortar team setting up about 2 clicks east. If they get those tubes operational, they can hit the landing zone. Sarah's fuel warning system was now beeping continuously, indicating less than 5 minutes of flight time remaining. She had to make a choice between engaging the mortar team and conserving fuel for the flight home. 2-3. Can you engage that mortar position? We're too low on fuel to make the run. Roger, Ghost. We're still flying, barely. Making attack run now. Reaper 2-3 turned toward the enemy position, trailing smoke and flying with obvious difficulty. Sarah watched her fellow pilot press the attack despite his aircraft's damage, knowing that protecting the extraction team was more important than his own safety. The 30mm chain gun from 2-3 raked the mortar position, eliminating the threat just as the Black Hawk lifted off with the rescued aircrew. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching her pilots perform under impossible circumstances, each one willing to sacrifice everything for their teammates. All Reaper stations. Extraction complete. Let's get these birds home before we have to walk. The flight back to base was tense as all 3 remaining Apaches nursed their damaged aircraft through the mountainous terrain. Sarah's fuel gauge was reading empty, but somehow the engines kept running. 2-3 was trailing more smoke and losing altitude gradually, while 2-2 had discovered damage to their hydraulic system during the engagement. Ghost, I don't think we're going to make it back to Chapman, came the worried voice from Reaper 2-3. We're losing power and I can see the landing zone for forward operating base Mitchell about 5 clicks ahead. FOB Mitchell was a smaller outpost with limited facilities, but it had a landing pad and fuel. More importantly, it was within range of their current fuel state. All stations were diverting to Mitchell. Declare emergency landing for all aircraft. The approach to FOB Mitchell was one of the most challenging Sarah had ever attempted. Her engines were running on vapor, 2-3 was barely maintaining controlled flight, and 2-2 was fighting hydraulic failures that made precise control nearly impossible. Mitchell Tower, this is Reaper Flight declaring emergency. 3 Apache aircraft inbound with battle damage and critical fuel states. The tower cleared them for immediate landing, and Sarah could see ground crews already positioning firefighting equipment along the runway. The sight of those emergency vehicles brought home just how close they had all come to disaster. Reaper 2-3 touched down first, the damaged helicopter settling onto the landing pad with a final puff of smoke from its engine compartment. 2-2 followed, the pilot fighting control problems right up until the moment the wheels touched ground. Sarah's Apache was the last to land, and her engines quit just as she pulled the collective down to settle onto the tarmac. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrifying. Another 30 seconds and they would have been making an auto-rotation landing in hostile territory. As Sarah shut down her aircraft and removed her helmet, she realized her hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the engagement was finally wearing off, replaced by the sobering realization of how close they had all come to not making it home. Jake climbed out of the gunner's seat and walked around to meet her as she exited the cockpit. His face showed the same mixture of exhaustion and relief that she felt. Hell of a day. Ghost. I don't think I've ever been happier to see a fuel truck in my entire life. Sarah looked back at their Apache, noting the numerous holes and scorch marks that decorated the aircraft's hull. They had been incredibly lucky to survive the engagement, but luck alone hadn't been enough. It had taken skill, teamwork, and the kind of split-second decision-making that only came from years of training and combat experience. Check 6, she said quietly, using the fighter pilot's traditional warning to watch for threats from behind. It was something she would remember for the rest of her career, the importance of situational awareness and never assuming the threat was over until you were safely on the ground. As the ground crews began assessing the damage to their aircraft, Sarah realized this mission would be talked about in Apache squadrons for years to come. It had everything: sophisticated enemy tactics, air-to-air combat, emergency landings, and a successful rescue under fire. More importantly, everyone had made it home alive. which was the only victory that really mattered in the end.